parking lot is full, but we might as well get going and at least get the logistics out of the way here.
All right. All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Luke Mortensen, planner. I'll be working alongside Chair Finkeldine this afternoon to facilitate the Zoom part of this meeting. Our consultants are with us, but they're zooming in today. Just a few housekeeping items that you've all heard before. This meeting is being recorded and broadcast on the city's YouTube channel and cable channel 25. For those on Zoom, please remember to mute yourself during the meeting when you are not speaking. As always, the chat function for this public meeting has been disabled. All the chats will come to me. If you're having any issues or have any comment you'd like to make to the group, send me that chat and we'll take care of that. Unless you are participating during the meeting, please turn your video off. That makes it a little bit easier for everybody here in the room. It makes the speaker, their screen comes up the largest. And this allows the active meeting participants to be seen easier. You'll still be able to hear the meeting, and then when you are participating, please turn your video back on. If you're having trouble, send me a chat. As always, the city reserves the right to mute people or turn individuals' videos off to minimize distractions during the meeting. With that, we'll turn it back over to Chair Finkeldine.
Sounds good. Looks like Marcy's appearing by train. We appreciate that. I know Kay Johnson said she's on a plane, so she was unable to do Zoom in. And hopefully a few more people wander in. For those not here earlier, the parking lot is incredibly full, so a few people might be parking and still walking, but we'll get a few more people. But Elizabeth, you ready to take this away?
I am, thank you. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, so we're gonna change up the agenda just slightly and show you the draft equity video that we've put together. Just so everyone can have a moment to think about it before we come back around to it later in the presentation. So we are trying my skills here. I'm going to attempt to show a full screen YouTube. Cross your fingers.
Equity and inclusion are several priorities identified by the City of Lawrence when it launched an effort to overhaul its land development code in 2022. Equity and inclusion are important values in its community. These values are reflected throughout the city's strategic plan and resulted in the creation of the city's Equity and Inclusion Department in 2020. One of the department's key goals is to ensure that inclusion and racial equity drive the culture of the city organization and the Lawrence community. Like Lawrence, cities across the country are working to address issues of discrimination, racism, and bias. One of the ways these efforts are playing out is through changes to zoning, the regulations that guide how and where development can occur within a community. No group, including historically marginalized groups, is disadvantaged or burdened, but bears a disproportionate share of negative consequences from land use decisions. All residents have effective access to the places and technology where input is gathered, the ability to make informed decisions, equitable participation in the process. Historically, zoning has been used to exclude unwanted uses and types of buildings from some neighborhoods while allowing them to occur in others. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, it is important to acknowledge that zoning has and continues to be used to exclude historically marginalized groups. Updating the land development code is one of several strategies within the city's control that can result in meaningful change in how we plan for and implement future changes to the built environment in Lawrence. Older neighborhoods in Lawrence have traditionally included a mix of single-family detached, attached, and multifamily housing options. Over the years, limitations were imposed in many areas to favor single-family detached homes by prohibiting or requiring lengthy approval processes for attached, manufactured, or multifamily housing types, and by establishing generous minimum unit or lot sizes that drive up the price of housing. Allowing for diverse options in more areas of Lawrence can make our community welcoming and accessible to a broader segment of the population, provide opportunities for residents to remain in their neighborhoods as they age, and reduce barriers to the construction of less costly forms of housing. In most areas of Lawrence, the current regulations are very prescriptive and reinforce a lower density suburban pattern of development. Providing more flexibility in the LDC can help make developments more affordable by allowing for more efficient use of the land. This includes reducing or eliminating parking requirements, reducing setbacks, reducing minimum lot sizes, and increasing maximum densities. These types of changes encourage infill and redevelopment and a more compact, walkable pattern of development. While some residents may be able to easily walk or bike to recreate or access a grocery store or doctor's office, other residents must drive across town. Allowing a wider mix of uses and implementing mixed-use zoning districts allows for a better distribution of services and amenities for all Lawrence residents. Expanding and updating public notice procedures can help us reach a broader audience for planning and development processes. This will allow for more residents to participate in the development process in a way that they can easily access and understand. We can all play an important role in making Lawrence a more equitable and inclusive community. You can help advance these priorities within the LDC by providing feedback on how the regulations can be more inclusive, communicating the importance of the proposed LDC changes to your friends, neighbors, colleagues, and city decision makers, and by staying involved in the LDC project.
Okay. So that was our first video. We plan on making videos for, wait, hold on. We don't want to watch any more YouTube. We plan on making videos for affordable housing and sustainability, and a zoning 101 video. So we wanted to share this one with you. We'll come back to this later in the meeting to get your thoughts and feedback. It's mostly just intended to orient people to the big issues and how the code will go about addressing them. But let's move on. Let's let that one sink in. I will pull up our PowerPoint. So tonight, this evening, unlike other meetings, we don't have a long involved PowerPoint. We're hoping in this December meeting to pick your brains a little bit. We spend a lot of time going through the whole prescribed list of things that we need to talk about. And we're looking for some feedback from the group on a variety of subjects and looking to have kind of a broader conversation. So this is the bring your practical skills to the project part of the project. And I'll walk us through and then ask some questions. Okay, so back to the agenda. We are here in the schedule. So we're still drafting development standards and we're moving into administrative procedures. We have gone through and updated some parts of the development standards. We're setting up follow-up meetings with other departments within the city so we can get more information about that. And some of tonight's conversation might also inform where we go with the development standards, the districts and the uses, and the administrative procedures. We have posted public comments on the website. So if you're interested to see the full feedback from Meeting in a Box, that's up and you can go look at that. And also the comments that we've received on Module 1 and general public comments that we've received. So those are all on the website. You can look at them. Everyone can look at them if anyone's interested. So tonight's discussion and relates to the information in the packet, but we're definitely not doing a pop quiz about the packet. That was just kind of to sort of flesh out some of these ideas. The first thing that we wanted to pick up was a continuation of the incentives conversation that we had, I believe, partially at our November meeting. We started down the path of when we want to see an outcome in development, how do we make a choice between mandating it and incentivizing it? And so we went out and took a look at some of the literature on incentives just to see if some incentives were more or less successful. And so just to bring everybody to the same place, what's a zoning incentive or what's incentive zoning? It's where we offer some sort of bonus or some sort of benefit to a developer in return for the provision of a public amenity, sometimes a private amenity, depending on what we're looking for. Zoning incentives can also be used to provide a workaround for gaps or prohibitions in state statute. So we talked about the inclusionary zoning is not beloved in Kansas statute, but by putting a potential voluntary inclusionary zoning program in the land development code, the city can still say, if you want to opt in, you can do it, but you don't have to do it. So we can fill a gap, or we can work around a prohibition that way, so we can make the benefit available. In the case of inclusionary zoning, you can have bonus density, but nobody has to do it. You don't want the bonus density and you don't want to do the affordable housing, great. Go do your stuff. One of the things highlighted in the article that we shared with you is that doing a cost benefit analysis is a best practice when setting up incentives. So does the provided incentive match the intended gain? And that's one of the things that we'll talk about and that we struggle with in writing incentives, because we don't write them very directly. And what do I mean by that? So when we look at this table that was in the article, the kind of that middle row with the question of what are the incentives you offer to developers. So this was from a study done within 134 metropolitan statistical areas. They asked questions of communities with populations between 250 and 1 million people. Their total sample size was about 1,700 municipalities. So the list of primary incentives were additional density, so additional development density, fast track or expedited review, and that can happen two ways. You can let an applicant jump the line if there's a line. That's a great way to irritate everyone else in the line. Or you can expedite review by saying, if you are submitting this thing we want to see, affordable housing, and you meet XYZ criteria, we will treat you more like an application for by right development. So you can have administrative review. You can go quickly. You don't have to have a hearing process. So that's a second incentive. Third incentive is additional height. And then the fourth incentive that didn't fall into the other category is reduced application and review fees. So not actually a lot of levers here. In terms of what communities are using. And you can see additional density at 76% far outpaces just about everything else. But there's a point of diminishing return on that. There's only so much an applicant can do on a site, and there's only so much that the city might want to see under the comprehensive plan. So as we're thinking about our conversation about how we're drafting and when do we use incentives, one of the things that might be challenging to us is, do we have a good toolkit of incentives? And so then we go to what are the benefits or amenities that communities seek through these incentives? And here's where you can kind of see that one-to-one connection doesn't work so well. So communities are looking for mixed use development, which we're more or less making very approachable within the code. So we probably don't need to incentivize for that. They're looking for open space conservation, could be open space donation, because in Kansas, requiring an open space dedication fell out of favor some years ago. This might be something that we want to talk about incentivizing. Increased pedestrian amenities or increased walkability. So if we start, kind of looking at these one-to-one, we have to look at how a developer might do their calculations, and is expedited review that might shave 4 to 6 months off of your approval process worth it to you to provide more pedestrian amenities, to provide more trails, because you're picking up construction costs there. So the other things communities want to see is affordable housing, public spaces, preservation of historic buildings, brownfield remediation, environmentally friendly buildings, public art and cultural amenities, public transit improvements, right-of-way for road projects, public access to a waterfront, noise buffering, stream bank restoration, and child care facilities. I would imagine if they redid the study in the future, that childcare facility is going to increase on the list. We're seeing a lot of that. So last slide on this, and then we'll get into the discussion. We're kind of wondering if we brainstorm this as a group, what incentives would we want to offer in Lawrence? Is there anything else that might work within the community based on how development approvals work, based on what is important to applicants, based on just sort of horse trading that's happened in the past? And are there any additional ideas that we want to explore in the realm of incentives? So are there other things that you've heard of that we want to put on this list? Because the initial list that we looked at from that study wasn't so great. It wasn't as robust as we'd want it to be. So no wrong answers here. You can throw out ideas, you can throw out stuff you've read, or you can ask questions. But where are we with incentives in Lawrence? What do we think would help get the kind of development we want to see? And if I could turn back to our chairman, because I am not in the room, do you want to go ahead and lead the conversation and see what we got going here? That'd be great. Thank you.
I will do that. Well, I think it's a good discussion. I'll only start by saying, back in the day when we were on the planning commission, we created the whole mixed use code and all that, and we thought we'd give all these incentives and no one ever used them. So I would be interested to know some from folks of why they never got used. But I also think that my other initial reaction is, at least what I've heard is, so many things are so case specific that almost a more, we created everything that was 1-for-1. If you do this, you get that. If you do this, you get that. And they're willing to do this, but they didn't want that. They wanted, and so big picture wise, I think if we're going to do incentives, we need, if you do anything in this bucket, you might be able to get something from this bucket. Not if you do this, you get that. If you do this, you get that. Because I think that's the only way to match it up to get what we want. But anyway, that's my initial reaction. Who has some thoughts? Nick, you said you had something?
So since you mentioned that, I do like the idea of opening the options up, though I do think there are cases to be made for certain incentives being tied to certain variances. So like having additional lot coverage of impervious surface should probably be tied to something like additional stormwater stuff that maybe isn't in the list of what you got to do stormwater wise, or something like having like a slightly more intense use, maybe you can only do that if you have more buffer yard or more trees or something. Like certain things I think are connected, and then others, like you're saying, a density bonus could be for any number of things, right? I don't totally disagree with the idea. I'm just thinking there are probably some justifications here and there. I was curious, Elizabeth, about that survey that you showed about, I forget if that was from you guys or not, but for the cities that replied, do you have an idea of how strict their zoning codes are? Because for cities that have very loose zoning codes, if there even are any anymore, I'd be kind of curious to see if there are places that don't see handing out incentives as very effective, if their zoning codes are already so open. Because I know part of the process here was to try to make it so open that we don't need things like planned urban developments or variances.
Great, Nick, and that's a super good point, because if we back up a second, there's kind of this tension between, do we just set the code wide open, like you're saying, and say, we've just made it super easy to do this thing that the community wants to see, or do we crank down the code and put the incentive on top of it? So now we haven't made it easy to do what the community wants to see, but if you do it, we are dangling extra space out for the developer. So we could bring that back to a more fundamental discussion of, on the whole, do we just want to make it not so the code is wide open, but so the code as it's put together makes the good things really easy to get approved?
I really struggle with the idea that we build in difficulties for developers only to give them back if we want, to get at something. And I guess I'd love a little bit more context on what it is we're incenting. Can you give me some examples of what we're talking about? What kinds of development we might be willing to make these exceptions for?
Well, a couple of them, I think she mentioned, and Elizabeth can jump in. One of the bigger ones is if you agree to make 15% of these permanently affordable. Right, that's gonna cost you some money. If you're gonna do that, we want to give you something in exchange for making it permanently affordable. We can't do that under state law as a requirement, not that we would do that, but if we did, but regardless, it's not even an option. But hey, if you would make 15% of those or 10% permanent, we will give you 2 more units, or we will reduce your setbacks, or we'll allow you to, we have some, but again, on the other hand, like you said, do we make the rules more flexible that people aren't asking for those things?
If those were there by default, not as an exchange, would you naturally get the things that you're wanting to incent? Would it come naturally?
Yeah.
Maybe not the guaranteed.
Guaranteed affordable housing will probably never be just given away.
I still don't know how we enforce that over time, but yeah, okay.
That's an example.
Right, I want to get Marcy's comment right. Marcy left us a comment, Elizabeth,
Yeah.
wondering how useful increased density is after we're doing that in many places already. Concerned that incentives for green building helps the developer and property owner more than the neighbors.
Yeah, I think,
Okay, yeah,
well, that was Nick's point. If we're having density anyway, and Gary's point, if you're encouraging density anyway, offering more density probably isn't, one, that appealing, and two, maybe not necessary. But other thoughts?
I have one specific idea, may not go very far with MSO and the city administration, but have we considered waiving system development charges for affordable housing? I mean, if we're talking
Yeah.
$2,300 to $4,500 a pop, that's money that could potentially be seen to encourage affordable housing.
Well, I think people do that. I think it's something worth talking about on the list.
I got it on the
Eric,
list. We can talk about it. Yeah.
Bill, Eric, you guys do some of this. Is there any?
Yeah, no, I was just trying to wrap my mind kind of around I think the feedback I get in the builder community sometimes is more to ask for like public land or parks or the walkways and how we can incentivize that, but like the actual cost to the builder developer, how does that get offset then in, what their product is, which is selling lots and houses. So the cost to create open space or public amenity gets funneled back directly into the cost of the individual houses. Just from a mere business perspective, like I think there's some challenges there on the financial side of how to make that work. So incentivizing that in a way that, if that's what the ask is, how do you offset that for public amenities?
Is that like a tax offset of some sort, or is that worth?
I was thinking of the same thing, because I think of these incentives, this list, in kind of 3 different categories. So one are the things that actually cost the developer more money. So the developer would have to do a cost benefit. Eric hit one, would be providing additional open space that costs them money. What do they get out of it? So do the incentives help them out? Additional building height, all of a sudden you go higher, you're looking at different fire code requirements, elevators, all of a sudden you're adding, to get an extra floor in the building sounds great until you start penciling out what it's going to cost you to put that additional
In
building.
that example, like you take a standard 2-3-story building, $250, $300 a square foot, but once you go above 4 or 5 stories, you're at $600 a square foot.
Yeah. So asking for additional height, I don't know if the city can give a builder enough unless you're downtown here, Additional square footage is kind of the same thing. Yeah, you get, there's an additional cost to that. Does that additional square footage transfer into a higher housing price? You know, but that's one bucket. The other one is things that, the city needs to think through whether they're willing to do a quicker review. I mean, yes, I guarantee you, if we had some opportunity for a faster review, there'd be a lot of incentives for that, but I would really like to hear somebody from the city tell me how that's going to happen because,
Or even some initial feedback early on.
yeah, because if you take an example of any recent project, the delays in the project are spread throughout the whole city. Once we get through one department, we're hit with another department, a whole new set of delays. We then go into another department, a whole new set of delays. So, how are you going to control that and how's that going to be managed? I mean,
Are you going to keep that promise?
yeah, how are you going to keep that? And then if you don't hold up to it yet, we've already made a commitment to do something on the site for that. How do we back that out? I mean, I just don't understand that. And then the third bucket would be things that really could be good. And your last one on here is listed as reduction in site requirements. And I'm not necessarily thinking in terms of reduction, but maybe alternative things in site requirements that may be out of the norm, but might be something that might be appropriate. And I don't know exactly what that might be. I'm always concerned about the landscaping requirements and how they impact the safety of the site. And in terms of how the lighting, like we talked about this last time, and the lighting and the parking and that whole deal just really needs to be thought through. And I think we need to be creative about that. So maybe there's some incentives on ways that we could be really creative that might do something that's out of the norm. And it'll be a win-win for everybody. So those are kind of the way I think through these. I don't have a lot of hope for really good incentives. Marcy mentioned, green buildings help the developer and the property owners more than the neighbors. I'm not so sure green buildings help the developer. Maybe the end owner.
I think it's maybe the other way around. I think the city would like to see green buildings, so the developer would get to do a thing like make it taller or something, make it more dense.
Yeah. But I'm just reading Marcy's note.
I know what you mean.
But she said the neighbor might not like that extra height.
Yeah. Her example was the neighbors might not like it.
They might like the
Yeah.
open space,
Nick,
but they might not like the height.
Yeah. Right.
Again, I guess, I kind of agree to a large extent, and I guess that was my point. I started with, one of the things I think we often run into is just the unique nature of some piece of property, unique nature of a street, a stream bed, and maybe almost if there is, and to be really creative about something. Well, you get creative when you get forced to, because you have a really interesting site, you have something that's driving that. And you'll never be able to write a code that memorializes those.
Mhm.
So it's almost like, maybe it's, again, I like the idea of having a more open code, but if we come up with something that we need to be creative about, one way is a variance,
Mhm.
but another way would be an incentive.
Mhm.
And let's see if we can trade something off there.
Yeah.
And that kind of open thing, sometimes you can get a variance and is the right call, but sometimes, you can't get the variance. We know that. We've run into that problem. The variance rules are limited. So maybe there's a way to say, hey, this is unique. Let's trade this incentive for that. And it'd be a cost benefit to the.
The one incentive that I think I would think through would be most developers have a pet type of project that they do. They're experienced in, they know how to do it, they know how to make money doing it. And if they have a piece of property and they are going to do their deal on this piece of property, yet the city, whoever that is, thinks that they're, part of this ought to be something else. That's where some incentives could come in because it's causing the developer to do something out of their wheelhouse. So there ought to be there needs to be some kind of trade-off to get them to do something that, per code, they could do one thing, especially if we're going with the mixed use. And they come in with, example would be they come in with a piece of ground and they're going to build apartments. And that's what they build. Yet there's the idea that maybe there's some need for some neighborhood commercial in this area. Maybe there might be some opportunity for in building office type uses, so maybe you need to incentivize these people to do that. I'm just thinking outside the box, right? So.
Yeah, Jeff, maybe that's a good question for you. I think, one pushback I've heard about this is kind of to Phil's point, okay, you're going to create this code that's going to let people to do all the sorts of stuff, but will they really do it? I mean, will the next subdivision just be, will anyone just be the normal subdivision? They'll say we could do all these things, but I don't care. We're just going to do what we've always done because that's what I'm used to building. Jeff, can you envision that? Someone walks in and says, here's a proposal and it fits the code, so you can't say no to them, but they can do that. Do you see a place where you can say, yeah, but if you do this, if you put some duplexes in there, if you build a triplex, if you, I know you don't normally do that, but if you do that, we could do X. Do you see that in your process?
I can see that fitting into the process. If you don't look at the code we currently have and just, throw that completely out of mind, I don't see why something like that wouldn't work in the process at the end of the day. I think it goes back to the point you made about you're always going to end up with a piece of land that may not have standard configuration or might have a quirk about it. And I think that's where something like that could potentially work to a mutual benefit in some way. So I think it's totally a possibility.
But it's true that in general, the whole approach so far has been towards density. So that reduces the possibility of having a wide range of incentives. I mean, I think we can all agree on that point.
Yeah.
That the incentives are pretty limited just because of the fact that the direction that's been gone so far has been to have an open by right code as the basic structure. So that, I mean, I'm kind of with Phil that I don't see too many incentives out there that fit it, but I also hear what Eric's saying. If you're giving up a piece of land, how do you fit that in your calculus, in the development calculus? I don't have any answers for that.
Yeah.
Rebecca has a comment.
Rebecca added, subsidized housing can certainly be made more possible with reasonable reductions in sidewalks. Not having to complete administrative tasks that are not necessary, reduced parking requirements, etc. Need a list and can ask for particular reductions in A, B, and C requirements that are expensive on a particular site. Every reduction in cost can help create affordability, but making the code allow density is going to do the most.
And I think maybe Rebecca's talking about stuff like the reports we require, a traffic study, maybe for this site, we don't have to do a traffic study or a downstream sewer study. We don't have to do this, that. Now, hopefully we're more flexible anyway in our new code, but I think that's maybe what she's referring to. On that end.
If I find myself just wondering if those are things we can do that safely and like don't have a traffic, don't think about downstream stormwater. I mean,
yeah,
you would have to have some pretty specific conditions where you decided it was okay to just not address that. But on every single one of those things, if we can't do them, I find myself wondering why we wouldn't just by default, not as an incentive. Why wouldn't we put that into our environment for everything? On the other side of that, I find myself wondering that, if I'm sitting on an item and we've decided, I'm going to pick an example, that we're going to allow reduced setbacks on some promise of affordable housing. does that mean that that's not allowed for any other condition where reduced setbacks are allowed or asked for or would be benefited?
Now, again, that's why I think it should be buckets.
Yeah.
I mean, again, to me, you have situations, I mean, the builder wants to build some houses and they can do 5-foot setbacks and some people do, but some people say, I want 10-foot setbacks.
Right.
I want 20-foot setbacks. The requirement's 5. And they just, and no matter what you incentivize, they're gonna build what they want to build, but again, maybe they bring that in and they say, this is what I want to do, and you say, well, okay, but what about X or Y? And maybe you get something you don't otherwise get, but I mean, I tend to agree with you. I mean, I don't know that with what we hope to get from this code, I don't know as, I'd rather have it more open and less incentive than heavily incentive based. But I do like the idea of knowing that we can't anticipate every situation. That we have some sort of incentive that helps us, gives us some flexibility to get something out of it.
I'd love to see what the types of things we want to incent are. I get affordable housing. We've got that in a number of different places, a number of different programs try to get at that. But some larger things like how do we drive mixed use development?
Yes.
Right. And what can we as a community do to make that happen? Those are bigger, larger kinds of things that we maybe want to attract a developer to come do.
I'm gonna go ahead and say this, that I love what we've done so far as affordable housing and all that other kind of, all those programs and what we're doing about that. But I tell you what, if cutting out sidewalks and street trees and setbacks and everything is okay for affordable housing, then it ought to be okay for everybody else.
Sounds like we're kind of converging then on having the open code and incentives almost being, there's a couple that are built into the draft, like you can get 5% extra floor area for blah, blah, blah. But it sounds like the code's probably open enough and by right enough that, we should be able to do what would have previously been considered an incentive, and now it's just normal. And maybe in the same approach that planned unit development is going in, like that's for the unforeseen, right? If there's some odd situations that come up in the future, like, turns out we do need to actually relax this particular requirement to get these kind of developments to pencil out, and we hadn't thought of that at the time. Maybe that's where an amendment comes in, or adding in later, like Brad, you were saying, this open pool of incentives. Like we know which levers can be pulled because developers will probably tell planning and development, and they are codified in the code. So, setbacks, street trees, stuff like that. If something has to be relaxed, we know where to look for that. But leaving it open and by right would be a really good start, I think. But then again, do we have to compromise with the public who's resistant to change, right? I feel like that's maybe where this is going to get watered down. And people start saying like, well, that's wonderful, but I don't want any of this stuff actually being built, right? Like, let's make it much harder to get these, more dense, taller, less setback properties. I think we are maybe a differently minded group than the average person who's used to what they've always seen. And that kind of worries me.
Brad, may I make a comment?
Yes.
Thank you. It seems to me, and based on my experience, as soon as you have ways to incentivize something, so it's different from whatever the rule is, there are going to be people who keep track of every single one of those and who then come to the planning office and say, yes, but in this case, you did this and this and this, and I'm just like that one, and I'm more like that one than the other one, and everything's going to become an argument. And I think that for neighbors and for people who have not had a lot of experience, it's helpful to know, okay, this is what's allowed for everybody. This is standard. And that maybe then there's the time to change the code if necessary, so that it's okay for everybody. We've been through that, changing the comprehensive plan after every single application. And I don't know how you feel about that.
So predictability, it sounds like, is key. So like reduce discretion, improve by right stuff, so everybody knows the score. I would agree with that.
Yeah, But the flip side of that is when, you know, predictability is used, you know, to not get what we want. You know, you have a piece of property that if you had 4.5 foot setback between the two houses, you could build two. Still have 5 on the edge, but you need 4.5 in the middle. And then the neighbors say, well, I don't want those two. You need 5 in the middle of those two houses because I only want one person. I don't want two houses there. I only want one. The code requires a 5 foot setback between those two new houses you built. Predictability says, don't give them 4.5. Now we haven't accomplished something we want, which is to get some density there in exchange for the predictability if you have to have 5 foot between those two new houses, no matter what.
Yeah.
I mean,
Would that go into a discretionary zoning situation though? I mean, if it's not permitted by right, the applicant could still, you know, bring it before, go through the planning commission and the whole process and get the 4.5 foot as in your example. I mean, is that making sense or am I just babbling?
That's probably what would happen in this case. It sounds
well,
like.
again, if might be a terrible example, so let's not go too far down the line, but the point would be, it could be a variance. It would not go to the planning commission or the city commission to make a political decision. It would be a variance from a code. And then the variance, it's a BZA would have to make a determination that the variance of that code was, X, Y, Z. And the BZA would make that quasi judicial determination. So it's not as clear cut as that. Now, if you had a provision, back to the point, I mean, one point would say, on one end of the spectrum, you could say, well, let the planning director in any situation vary the setback by 20%, no matter what. Right? That would be a very permissive. Another one would say, we can vary that setback by 20% if you make one of those permanently affordable. Now the person's making that decision, right? That would be an incentive based versus a completely discretionary versus a absolute rule that has predictability. You see how those, three things go, and so I think there'll be a lot of people who look at all those differently. Too much discretion is one reason we got the code we have now that's so thick. Every time we made an exception, someone changed the rule and we just kept adding to it.
This code will be thicker.
But it'll be thicker,
Got a lot of pictures.
but easier.
Got pictures.
Pictures.
So it sounds like then the 3 options, if I heard you correctly, are, like 3 very black and white options, right? Are wide open by right. On the other side, pretty discretionary, and somewhere in the middle is that sort of open-ended incentives, a bucket of incentives and levers that could be changed. Which I would support that. I don't know how we would write that necessarily, but I think the devil's in the details there.
So I think we can do all 3, actually. Go on.
Well, I
There we
like
go.
that.
Yeah, it just depends on what it is we're regulating.
Yeah.
I think I'm coming away from this conversation. I'd love to know if if we could get an understanding of the development community's biggest headaches, right? So the open space dedication or the sidewalk headaches in terms of cost that are over and above. I think the group kind of has circled through this conversation to in Nick's list, more stuff by right than anything else. And then a lot of the discretion, we're going to see that when the administrative procedure section comes through. So where Brad was a minute ago, we almost always put in a section that says staff can adjust measurable standards by 20%. And they don't need anybody's blessing to do that. So we'll see how that plays out with the whole thing. I think to further this conversation, what Gabby and Brody and I might do is go back and review the code and highlight anything where we think the levers or the incentives would go in. I think, to where Gary was much earlier, what got us started on this as a topic was when we were talking about sustainability. And do we require houses to be solar ready? And we dodged that one as consultants by saying, that's a building code issue. But it exemplifies sort of we can regulate so far, and then where's the place where we've gone a step too far? So now we've added so much cost to it that it doesn't matter how wide open we leave it, it's not going to happen. So if I can take this conversation back from you guys, but move you into the next one, because that was really helpful. Okay, so we had the paired articles, Reduce, Reuse, Recycle from the Atlantic and Gridlocked from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. And again, none of these we are giving to you as this is the only truth that we see. We're trying to frame up some issues for discussion. And we thought that these two, along with the article from Vermont about the battery storage, might bring us to the issue that Gary put out there. How are we planning and regulating for energy down the road? And so I wanted to ask Gary, and I totally don't want to put you on the spot because I know you're putting an idea out and we're filling it in, but are we on the right track in terms of we're talking about renewable energy primarily, and we're talking about how to get it more broadly into the community? Are we talking about the grid? Are we talking about traditional fossil fuel energy sources? Do you have any parameters around this conversation you want to share?
Sure. So there's a couple facets to this. One is the source of the power, and you could think about renewable energy, and we've talked about solar and how the city can be doing maybe more in terms of talk about wanting to incent something. If we could incent the placement of the creation of X amount of energy generation across our community to help relieve some load, that's an awesome thing. And that's a part of what we ought to be thinking about. What does individual like or community like or small neighborhood like energy generation look like? I'm going to stop there because you can talk for a day on topics like that. The other part of that conversation talks about storage, which is an emerging technology. It's not that batteries haven't been around, but that is the key to how energy is going to be used inside of our communities. And then you have the grid, which is the piece that connects us all together. And those things are evolving. Today, the Southwest Power Pool is this gigantic grid that we're a part of. But more and more, with the use of storage and the use of on-site power generation, community scale grid, microgrid, and there's some other terms to use that, are going to be more about how a community interacts with the larger energy producers that are out there. Michael's been a great advocate of community scale and generation. And I think that rather than develop without this in mind, we should think about how do we, and then wait for energy companies to come in and we give them awesome powers of eminent domain to do what they have to do to fill the need. The idea is develop with that architecture in mind. How does the architecture of a future state of Lawrence fully enabled for a community scale grid? What does it look like? And how would that find its way into questions that we're asking, the things that we're asking of developers, the things we want to incent developers to, riff on today's topic. Elizabeth, is that what you were looking for?
Yep, that's super helpful. Thank you.
And I would say 2 examples, I think, just to bring that home and then ask the question. I mean, again, one would be, what if a developer wants to come in and build a neighborhood and they want to put 6 big solar panels at the corner, because they want to market their new neighborhood as self-reliant, but not necessarily on every house. is that a residential use? Is that an industrial use that requires rezoning? Is that allowed?
Right.
Same would be, they now have these big batteries that basically sit inside a truck. I mean, like what I'm talking, a container. That, again, that you could put somewhere in 3 or 4 or 5 houses, all who have solar on the roof can store that energy in there at night and then during the day and then pull it out at night.
Yep.
And they share that battery. Is that industrial? Is that allowed by right? Is that,
Some of our
special use
traditional
permit?
ways of thinking about it may not apply.
Yeah,
We may have to have some different kind of categories. And
is that open space?
along that same line, how do we think about open space or green space now? Is it considered open space if it's covered with panels?
That's actually where I was just going, like
Yeah.
an incentive for a developer to entice them in that and utilize that open space. Do you do, a pavilion out there with a solar array on the roof to where, the community could still use a covered space, but then the roof of it is, generating.
Questions we've never asked before, how many electric bikes do we need to charge? Cars do we need to charge? What's the draw from the planned development? And then how do we work with energy companies to build the infrastructure in as we're developing? So it's just a whole different set of things to think about. And energy generation is a part of that. So
Michael, I know you're on community, solar and community energy. Any thoughts you want to throw in here at the moment or?
Do I have a comment?
Yeah, do you want to jump in here? I'll let you say something if. I know it's a topic of yours.
Well, I appreciate Gary bringing up the microgrid, community solar, community wind. A lot of that, really, the infrastructure is something that has to do with utility. Whether they can enable these microgrids that tie into the larger grid. That's not something that anybody other than maybe the Kansas Corporation Commission could actually do. But on the local scale, I could see a couple things about what we just mentioned. For instance, solar ready. One of the elements that implies is that the structure of a roof of a building, of a house, that will support solar panels. Because sometimes solar people get called to a house to put up solar panels and say the roof's not strong enough. That's a big part of solar ready. Another part, though, would be the electrical system within the house that would be its adequate amperage, wire capabilities already installed, things of that sort. So there's some things that we can control in the code locally, other things not. Batteries, for example, you're talking about a microgrid, 20 different houses all tied into a microgrid as a backup. If the major grid goes down, they all could have batteries in their basement, or they could have one battery on the corner lot, like you said. Which way are we going to go? And I don't think it would be in industrial use if they're in people's basement. So yeah, it's just a matter of, how you do it and where you do it.
and to expand on that, there is some thinking that's currently out that with more and more electric cars come, they all have big batteries.
Yeah.
Those become a part of the
Very good.
microgrid,
Right.
right? If we are provisioned appropriately for it.
There are test programs right now in California.
Yeah.
I think in conjunction with Tesla, but maybe others doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just different ways of thinking.
Yeah.
But in terms of the land development code, are you suggesting that the special permit use of, using Brad's example, this large storage container, that this can be a permitted use in R2 under special permit? I mean, is that what we're talking about?
Is it permitted by right or is it permitted by special use permit or is it permitted by?
I'd be careful with permitted by right on a technology that we're not even sure where.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's the question. Or is it industrial? You know, again, I think we have to figure out, I mean, I think the point here is to think about that and consider how they might be put into the code, because right now, if that happened, Jeff would be looking around going, I don't know, is that industrial?
The zoning districts are what they are. I mean, you've got residential zoning districts, you've got mixed use districts.
Yeah.
Uh,
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
We have to just think about it. Nick?
Hey, just as a matter of clarification, because it sounds like everybody's curious how it's actually zoned. In the current draft of the code, every single district has an allowable permitted accessory use for the renewable energy facility, which is defined as pretty much solar or a micro wind turbine. So
But that's accessory to your own house, not accessory to the neighborhood.
it's accessory to whatever is on it. So if it's multifamily development, if it's a power plant, if it's a park, a hospital.
Yeah, but that, well, at least the way I read that, and maybe I'm wrong, and that'd be great, is if you wanted to build one, if you wanted to build, 10 solar panels on, on the green space.
Yeah.
That's not associated with any one house, not accessory to, it's accessory to a whole
Yep.
neighborhood.
So I think the easiest way to do that would just be to add it as a principal use if that ends up being desired. It sounds like at this point, I mean, it's accessory everywhere, which is kind of cool. So, I mean, if it's on a land that happens to be parkland, just stick it in the corner or something, or make a pavilion out of it. It's pretty allowable at this stage.
That's good.
Yeah, I'm just interested, maybe a little concerned about how we as a city are responsible for neighborhood batteries. I mean, we're not. It's kind of like neighborhood swimming pools, right? They're responsible for that. We have no responsibility to govern, maintain, inspect.
No, but as long as they're allowed.
Right.
That's my only point.
But as long as it stops there,
Yeah.
because we're not
No,
responsible
absolutely.
for anything else beyond that step. Yeah.
I guess my concern is someone says, hey, I want to do that. I want to create an HOA that has a pavilion, a swimming pool, has some
And as long as
battery
they
and
have.
has this.
Mhm.
And then someone says, well, that's an industrial use. You can't do that.
Mhm.
And or it's not in the code. We have to go through a 6-month process to amend the code before we can, decide whether or not. And then they're going to say, well, forget it. We're just going to do something else. I mean, I think that's what you're asking for is, Gary, is to think about that in the code a little bit ahead of time. And again, is it a special use? Is it a not allowed? I mean, whatever we end up with, at least think about it.
So that, some of the questions are great questions. Those are how we action it. I'd love to understand what the architecture looks like. I'd love to have probably Evergy because they're our primary energy provider here. I'd love for them to help us understand what Lawrence looks like 10 years from now based on the energy demand that's out there and what they believe, what they're planning for to come. If they could architect a city, what would that look like? I'm not saying we have to do it, but it'd be sure interesting to understand from their perspective what they plan to use eminent domain to accomplish after we've done whatever we're going to do.
But one aside here, last time my wife and I were in Osawatomie, I saw they were putting in a microgrid on the north side of town. You all might check and see what's involved with that. Over there by the hospital, right up on the north side of town there was a big sign that was all fenced off. Probably part of Evergy's deal, but you might find out what the heck it is. How it might play into this, if it does.
Yeah, I remember being part of a council with Evergy about 5 or 6 years ago when they started promoting renewable energies and, they were going around into different communities and, basically putting solar arrays and then you could like buy it back as a consumer. So I know that they're doing that at a grand scale.
Well, this one was labeled microgrid, I mean, so I'm not sure, that's all I haven't seen it.
I think again, see what they might be interested in, at least ask them the question.
I'm working on a contact.
Elizabeth, Marcy has something to say. Marcy, welcome.
Thank you. Had a good walk from the train station. So I think we need to recognize that solar panels have been going in. Certainly the community mercantile is a good example. And we didn't need special zoning to get those panels installed as part of the parking lot sort of redevelopment. I think I would be happy and can help with some contacts at Evergy. We also could be talking to the Sustainability Advisory Board and asking them to do a deeper dive on this for us. But the issues I think we're going to run into for what people are talking about is like, 10 houses in a neighborhood is going to be, how do you pay for that electricity? Who uses it? Because we don't allow wheeling. So an entity could not charge for electricity unless we change the state law. And there's some good reasons not to do that. So it can be a park, a hospital, the grocery store can all do that quite easily. A neighborhood development would be more complicated, and Evergy can help explain this to us.
Good.
Marcy, can you explain the term wheeling? I've never heard that before. Like wheeling and dealing, or what does that mean?
Well, wheeling would be creating electricity and selling it. So you can create electricity within, we are part of the Evergy district, so they have the monopoly on selling electricity. Anybody can produce electricity or generate electricity, but they can't sell it.
Excess electricity either goes into storage or it could be net metered back to the utility. But and I'm not imagining that I set up my own power plant.
Yeah.
My house. I'm not imagining a scenario like that. But yeah, Marcy's right that there are limitations today based on however old our technology is. I'm just saying.
Okay. Well, let's
start looking.
As long as you can put electricity access somewhere, like if net metering is allowed, good. That's probably good enough.
Yeah.
So I also found that on the principal use table, utilities minor and utilities major are allowed nearly everywhere. And I think that is the category under which would come just like a random standalone solar facility. So I think that's covered. Utilities major is not allowed in the residential districts, which would make sense. But minor counts as electrical and gas distribution substations, lift stations, telephone switching boxes, water towers. So probably solar panels.
Makes sense.
Good to add. Elizabeth, is that what you need?
Yep.
What else?
That was great. Thank you. Yep. Okay, next. Okay, so we can skip some of this because we're talking smaller scale. I did want to ask, and so I'm going to say I only know about the wind project because I've heard everyone had to work late. But if we are talking about more solar or more wind or more panels, more things in neighborhoods, do we need to talk to the public about this? One of the things in the Gridlocked article was that NIMBYs, people who don't want the project, not in my backyard, and soft costs are some of the biggest obstacles to more power generation. So do we have any lessons we want to learn either from the larger scale projects or from where Marcy had us on, hey, the Merck did this and everyone was fine with it? Is there a cutoff point in there? Is there any wisdom you guys want to share about where the rest of Lawrence is going to go when we start saying solar, that mini solar array that you did on the corner of your residential development is cool and it's allowed by right?
I'll let Gary jump in here because he's lived this, but my general impression is that the people speaking for it live in Lawrence and the people speaking against it live outside of Lawrence. And since this is just a Lawrence code, it might not. Again, of course, we don't have 300 acres in Lawrence where you're going to put a big farm. I mean, we're talking smaller scale, but Gary, you've lived in.
But yeah, your observation is correct. The rural Douglas Countyans are in a couple of camps. One, if it's if there's not a project that's anywhere near them, they're generally in favor of renewable energy. In fact, the people where a project might be close to them are generally in favor of renewable energy. But I haven't found anybody yet, other than participating landowners who live next to an industrial scale project who want anything to do with it. It may or may not happen. Those things are coming up, in front of the commissions, even this month. But it begs a question about where responsibility lies for the production of that energy. Do we, as residents of Lawrence, the people that live inside the city, are we okay with just shoving that out to our rural neighbors to deal with? Or should we be doing everything we can to contribute to producing and caring for the load that we are the one in fact consuming? I think we ought to be doing everything that we can to participate. I'm not saying that the county can't also, but we ought to be doing as much as we can as well. That's a little bit of the general theme that's out there, as well as Gary's own opinion.
I have a question. Well, in Lawrence, we have a unique situation it's the Bowersock Dam. Bowersock. I mean, that is a energy producing facility, right?
Yes.
So in Lawrence, we have an asset like that. I mean, what is it? I'm totally ignorant, other than I drive by it occasionally. What is it? Well, how does that work? I mean, for our communities.
I've been told it does not, that the electricity goes to Kansas City, in fact, while the coal plant does provide our electricity, so.
Both go good, but no, they're privately owned, and they have a contract with the Wyandotte County BPU. And every entity like Evergy or Wyandotte has to have so much renewable in their portfolio under federal law. Wyandotte partially satisfies that by buying all of the energy from that dam.
And I could be getting in a real gray area here, and you can tell me to stop, but why didn't Lawrence?
Well, we don't buy, it has to be Evergy or Wyandotte or Baldwin City. Evergy could have bought it. Evergy could have bought it, but
turned it down.
but they didn't. Wyandotte, but it wouldn't have been the city. We couldn't, again, back to the whole microgrid, we can't buy our electricity from them. They have to sell it to a regulated entity, then. So.
And it's a premium, right?
And it also generates.
I think Baldwin has its own power plant, I think. They're supported by Evergy, but they have their own power plant, so. So again, each entity has to have, depending on all the KCC rules and other stuff, so that's why you'll have some of that.
There's a nuance there that it's kind of important to understand. We say that, they're doing it, but it's for Wyandotte. There's no line connecting Bowersock.
I know it all goes.
They're putting load up into the grid, right? So it's the nature of electrons is to go to its closest possible, right?
But I will say, technically, Lawrence buys all of our energy, 98%, someone help me, 98% of our energy from an Evergy wind farm. Okay. We signed a contract for the next 15 years to buy, someone who know the details better than me, exactly how much. We buy so much energy at a per cost basis. And so we technically, same thing, we Lawrence buy our energy from Evergy from renewable. Yes, you can do that at your house.
Right.
By signing up, both gas and electric. You can buy your energy, both your gas can come from renewable and your Evergy can come from renewable by signing up for that at your house. Yeah, Marcy. Thank you.
I know that we talked earlier about incentives. And so during this discussion, I'm wondering if there'd be any way to give incentives for putting solar panels in a parking lot. Because it's less jarring than, just on the ground. It provides shade. And so that would be an interesting way to think about incentives.
I feel like a revolving loan program could probably accomplish something like that, because if you're doing it right, you should be offsetting your costs by installing solar and generating your own electricity. The payoff period it varies considerably depending on how you do it, but there should be a payoff period for the most part. I don't think, not everybody's doing this out of the goodness of their heart, right? I mean, it does save you money if you just get free sun energy. I don't know if that's a zoning code thing, though. I feel like that's maybe a city treasury thing. to establish a revolving loan fund, but I guess the rules to make any of that possible, I think, are in this draft code already, which is basically 0.3 and 4, or at least 0.3, that you can make accessory and primary renewable energy uses. No public hearing.
So
You got a lot of first.
I was responding to Gary's hope that we find some more places to generate electricity. And the larger scale, the better off we're going to be. So if there is a parking lot, that's a better place to put it than on 10 individual roofs. You're going to get a better payback in terms of your energy. So anyway.
And better than in the park down the street over green grass or whatever.
Yeah.
So, but Nick, with respect to that 0.3, are you saying that in all residential zoning, base zoning districts as well, that minor, that less than utility level renewable energy is permitted by right? Is that how you're reading?
That's what it appears to be. I think that's an Elizabeth question, just to make sure, because I'm not the expert here. That's what it looks like in the principal and accessory use tables, but I could be wrong.
I don't have it open because I'm tracking the conversation. So I'm gonna ask Gabby or Brody to check. That's usually how we do it, though.
Okay.
The more obstacles you throw up, the less likely someone is to use it. So we tend to start that way. I want to go back to where Marcy was, though, because that was my question. If we're thinking about where else energy could go in Lawrence, or the amount of space needed to produce energy at some point in time, is this something that we'd want to tackle maybe with Evergy at a larger scale, or do we feel like that's too far out? And I'm thinking about it in terms of where we were earlier. We require some accounting across the city for parks and open space or for trails. Do we think about where energy production goes? Or do we just clear the decks in the code and say, you can do it on the roof, you can do it on the lot, you can do it on the parking lot? Eventually, this will all add up.
I think,
And Michael's going to say something and related to that or something different.
Yeah.
Okay.
Add into that. That's kind of a central question about scale. Kind of a primer on electric grids. You've probably heard the term distributed generation. Maybe not. Generally, we think of spread out over the area instead of concentrated in a large scale. But what it actually refers to is there's a large scale transmission grid, big grid, Southwest Power Pole, and then there's the distribution grid. They work at different voltages, a high voltage transmission grid, low voltage distribution grid, which is what connects to our houses. Those wires are the distribution grid. Any facility like the solar panels on my roof that puts electricity out there, it goes into the distribution grid. That doesn't require wheeling, as Marcy called, a substation, anything like that. But it goes onto the grid. And that's kind of what defines a microgrid. It happens at the distribution grid level. So there's that cutoff point. And I don't know technically what that cutoff point would be by Evergy's definition, but it's just a matter of scale. So that you might look into how those two are defined electronically, technically, or whatever.
It's good. Good question.
It's good.
Helpful.
1,000 K.
I guess I tend to think, yeah, we want to make it more allowable across the city, be it on your parking lot or on your roof of your commercial building or on the roof of your apartment or on the roof of your house. I don't know. I think so.
So this is probably going to be more for the county, and Gary, you probably come across this, but it seems like a lot of the resistance, at least written down, is to large scale solar, is that we have prime agricultural farmland and that covering it with solar is not a great use of it. I don't know if that's truly what people think is the most important thing, or is it just because it's right near their houses? I'll give people the benefit of the doubt and assume that it's because we have really good soil. But there is technology that very easily allows you to do both. It's called agrivoltaics, and it's basically like these, like rails essentially, where you move the solar panels along the crop fields to shade and provide these little microclimates that allow things to grow better than they would if they didn't have shade over them. And as the climate gets hotter and the sun gets more intense and droughts get worse, it's gonna be really important to actually have that.
And without spelling out any how you do it, we have encouragement for agrivoltaics built into the solar code.
What does it look like? Is it just like, if you do this, you can.
You put a quarter in, and it's, you have to let it run out. It's, there's a whole lot to it. Again, without going into the specific of how you accomplish it.
Yeah.
We encourage agrivoltaics, and we infer preference to plans of submissions that include an agrivoltaic component.
You got any yet?
Whether it's pollinators or whether it's small row crop, or whether it's grazing of sheep, or whatever whatever you might be able to put in there. And there's complications with all of them. The concepts behind we're getting off of landing on the code here.
So we have like 20 seconds.
All right. So the concepts behind this were inside this code were built knowing that they would largely be on large flat surfaces in the Douglas County. That's going to be prime farm ground. We recognize that's going to happen. So all of the rules that are there are designed to protect the soil so that while it's in place, it becomes a land bank so that the soil actually improves over time. That's the concept behind it. So, but we're way off of land development.
Elizabeth, what else you got?
Okay, let's go. Switching gears, bikes and peds, and particularly bikes. So, looking at the 2050 transportation plan, we got the statistic that the total bikeway access is 36%. 36% of Lawrence is accessible by bikeway, and we've had conversations in the community about increasing the bikeway connectivity and making it easier for people to get where they want to go safely on their bicycles. So the first question is are we far enough along within the city planning process to start taking the code and saying that the bikeway connections are a mandatory aspect of development? Bearing in mind the conversation that we had not 15 minutes ago about every time we add something on, we're adding to the cost of development. So kind of want to talk about, are we far enough along, and this might be a question to staff also, at a policy level to know what connections need to be made, and do we put those in the code? And where is the city in terms of making this a mandatory requirement? At the end of all of my sort of circling the topic, I guess I would also ask, is this something that we want to send up to City Commission for their guidance? Sometimes we hit a policy topic in code writing where we're not sure if the policy is complete. And if we know what the priority for requiring bikeway connections are and where the design requirements are, and if we should go down this path with the code. So I want to know if our group is confident in the information that the city has done in terms of planning bikeway connections, pedestrian connections, that we should say the pedestrian plan and the bike plan all get implemented, or do we need to ask for more guidance and direction?
Jeff, I'll turn to you. I mean, I can try to handle the policy thing, but where are we at on MPO and the new bike plan and the pedestrian plan?
I think to get my plans in the right order here, I think the bike plan is wrapping up and should be progressing along pretty well at this point in time. The pedestrian plan is, I think, completed. I can't remember if it was just completed or long completed. I just think it was yesterday.
Just completed.
That's what, thank you, just completed. And the city has adopted the complete streets policy of probably 5 or 7 years ago at this point in time. And so we use that as a guidance document when we're having discussions about subdivisions and those details. But, you know, I think that's a I think the question that Elizabeth poses is quite well is we've got, I think, a lot of our plans and policies in place. It's just a question of, do we want to carry those forward into the code itself today? One more step down.
So as the MMTC guy, I can kind of add some stuff here. I think a lot of this is going to be tricky because it's under MSO's jurisdiction, so it doesn't really come under planning and zoning typically. Like, where are the bike lanes supposed to go? What do the bike lanes look like? How big do the sidewalks have to be? A lot of that is covered there instead in the engineering design standards. I think in terms of sidewalks, I think what the city wants in terms of eliminating gaps and increasing access, that's covered in what we have here already in the subdivision standards, I believe. For the most part, I think that does meet the intention. As far as bike stuff, I don't think there's any requirement that I've seen in the code so far for shared use paths, other than like completing a connection outside of a cul-de-sac. And I don't think that there's anything for establishing bike lanes necessarily. It's also kind of tricky because the subdivisions are being built on the edge of town. The bike lane may not extend there at this point in terms of what the primary and secondary routes look like and where they go. So it's kind of hard to say, I guess, until plans get proposed, like, do we want a bike lane here or not? I don't know. So that will decrease predictability, I suppose. I feel like this is the kind of thing that maybe needs to be a discussion with MSO and MMTC probably. And it could even be a joint session with the planning commission to try to figure out how we make this happen, right? Because at this point, the city's basically playing catch up with, a century of car dependence, trying to retrofit bike and ped infrastructure into older neighborhoods. And that's not really much that we can do with the zoning code, I think. Because even if you redevelop a lot that doesn't have great bike infrastructure on a certain street, you're just that lot. There's only so much you can do about the rest of the street or the network. So I don't know if this is maybe the appropriate place for that.
Well, Elizabeth, that means I hear, listening to Nick there, I hear two different things, or two different, like I said, one's MSO, which is subdivision regulations. How big a right of way do you have to leave for the street? And then who does what's in that street? That probably is in the subdivision side of it. The other would be like, if you're building a new subdivision, do you have to dedicate land to get from a street through the neighborhood to to the loop, for example? Is that, that's a second thing, which is not so much MSO, that'd be more, would that be in subdivision? Would that be in planning? Would you be dedicating that, or would it be?
It's gonna be in both, I think, Brad,
Okay.
because the city also wants to see redevelopment. And so, whereas we can't require applicants to go back out and fix what doesn't exist. So where Nick was, the gaps, we can't tell, Phil on his property that's already developed that he has to go out in the backyard and build bike lane. But if somebody is redeveloping and they are in a place where there is an anticipated or planned multi-use path, that redevelopment or new development should be connecting. So it is tricky because you're going to get incomplete segments. It comes in bits and pieces. The city's got to come up with money somehow to complete the rest of the pieces. But we do want to make sure that the code goes as far as it can go to start getting stuff put in place. And so that brings us back to our question of, do we know where the multi-use paths are planned? Do we know what sort of sidewalks are required? So it sounds like we know most of that information, maybe not all of that information. Is that an accurate assessment?
So
I want to ask a question. I'm not sure if this is the right place for it, but one of the products of how we've developed over the years, one of the things that we're talking about is setbacks that we have and the amount of space that we have between where a home is and where a street is. And we're trying to manage that going forward. A new development allows for more density. Doesn't that also, though, mean that there is some space today? Like, for example, I know that the parking along my street next to my house I'm required to maintain it, but it's not mine. the city can do with that what they want to do with that. It exists all over our town. And the fact that that's something we want to change means that it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. Should we be thinking about how we leverage that existing opportunity now to fully enable multimodal? We said we can't do it where it already exists. I guess that's what I'm challenging. Can we? Is that really true?
Well, on the roads,
Can
we
we?
can. The roads, we.
Or next to the
Well,
road,
the next, yeah, we have,
right?
we have right,
In between the sidewalk and the road. It's
depends where it's at, yes, yeah.
So do we just want to keep paving? I mean, just, you're
That's what
talking
I'm saying.
That's what I'm.
27-foot street, now we get
Yeah.
5-foot bike lanes and then sidewalks on both sides. All of a sudden, we've got out of a 80-foot right of way, we got 75 foot of pavement.
Yeah.
I mean,
No,
it's just.
I'm not suggesting that, but if you've ever been to a city that was designed for true multimodal, where they had bikes and cars, neither one compromising the other, there's a little bit more pavement, but it's really more about the design
Yeah,
than it is just, putting everything under asphalt.
Well,
I'm just asking the question.
yeah, those are a lot of MSO, I think those are a lot of MSO questions. I do think, we've struggled with this on sidewalks and we'd certainly struggle with it if our pedestrian plan says, whatever, I'm making something up. Tennessee is supposed to have a multimodal path along it. And it's supposed to be 10 feet wide. And again, it's on our right of way, but the city's gonna pay for that. At some point, if that's what we're gonna do, we decide to. But hey, if you want to rezone your house, we make that developer put in all of a sudden, small sidewalk, 10-foot use path, small sidewalk. And, do we require that, knowing one day we're gonna put the rest in, or
Yeah.
by the time it gets there, it falls apart,
If we do it incrementally only through redevelopment, yeah, that's what you get.
Yeah, and so.
Require something larger.
So one of these questions I know we've had is, we've done that with sidewalks on both sides of the street. When someone wants to put in a new house, we say, put that in, and we've gotten some sidewalks to nowhere. I think we worked on addressing that.
Yeah. Different parts, yes.
Different parts, different ways to do that, so.
Yeah.
But I think that's one of these questions, do you make it happen? And I guess I'm not saying, I don't know that we do it on a individual by individual basis, because I think that just leaves us,
Not if we want fine grained development.
yeah.
That will make a lot of sense, I think. I do think there is a interesting opportunity with greenfield or even larger scale redevelopment stuff to provide totally separated bike and walking paths. So in a lot of suburbs in, say, the Netherlands or Austria or Sweden, they have bike paths that aren't even on the road. They're totally separated. Like they might go down a utility easement or an alleyway. They have their own bridges. Like you have to cross the road occasionally, but rarely, which is pretty cool. So for getting, kids and the elderly to ride bikes, that's the way to do it. Now, in terms of connections, I don't know. I mean, if you have some curvilinear track development out in the edge of town, it would be nice to be able to bike, in between the backyards of houses, for example, instead of on the street. But I don't know if we should be requiring that or just maybe allowing it to happen with, fairly liberal rules on easements and stuff.
It does start with a good overall, what is our plan?
What's the plan?
Mhm.
Ask you to unplug me, please.
Yeah. Michael, you have no opinion on this, do you?
Yeah, maybe put it into perspective. We have a goal to have sidewalks, at least on one side of the street, on 100% of our streets, basically. As far as Sustainability Action Network, our proposal that is before you, we're not talking about 100% of the streets. And Phil is going to agree with me on part of this and disagree with me on part of it. What we're calling for is that for most of the streets, I don't know, 80%, whatever, residential streets primarily, no bicycle lanes as such, just make the street narrower, which is what I think you agree with. Narrower streets, it's all over the internet right now, or safer streets, or slower streets with parking on one side, which kind of makes it narrower for most streets. And then if possible, lower the speed limit to 20 miles an hour. The other part of that picture is on the high-speed streets, collectors and arterials require bikeways And I would say separated like Nick's talking about. Those are the streets that are most dangerous with the traffic, with the turns, with everything. Require that through benefit district, that the developer. It's part of the development, just like the sidewalks were paid for with a benefit district. So it's how much you do in what area. We're not asking to require it everywhere, just arterials and collectors. Separated by these.
And then I know MSO and the size of the street, has been a discussion and,
Constantly.
constantly, that's probably a discussion we have to have at the city commission level. When we get to that, would that be part of the recommendation in the subdivision regulations? With MSO, or is that separate? Can I
We
use
would
this-
recommend changes to the subdivision regulations. So, yeah, we'd recommend it for subdivision, and actually, we would recommend it for, I think where Nick was going was right, larger redevelopment. So maybe not on that lot by lot basis, but if someone is, pulling out a strip mall, and redoing it, that might be a place where you would do, the bikeways also.
Yeah, there could be some threshold, like if you're redeveloping a plot that is so and so percentage of this street. And you happen to be on a primary or secondary bikeway network as defined by Bikeway 2050, whatever, I forget what it's called, then thou shalt. Make it,
Yeah,
work.
but I would add a caveat to that, because I can think of a lot of older shopping areas we've got here in town that we would love to have redeveloped. And then you start adding the new lighting requirements, the new parking lot landscaping requirements, the new access requirements, adding on putting bike lanes on two different sides, you just killed any opportunity for redevelopment. So I think we got to be very careful about that, because it goes back to incentives. Incentives don't have to be, just outright. I think there's a lot of give and take there. And if we want to have some of these older areas redeveloped, we've got to come up with ways to where we can help them get that done.
I fully agree. If we have this, I think we should keep that in the incentive bucket rather than in the you got to do it bucket. Yeah, that makes sense. Especially because, eventually the city is going to come through and do it, and it would be nice if the developer could do it on their own. But if not, it's going to happen eventually anyway. And I feel like at this point, our priorities are more on more housing than they are on more bike lanes. So yeah.
Anybody else?
Yeah, what else?
That'll get us going. Okay. That's it. That's it for our big topics. And that was super helpful. I'm going to talk less and let you guys talk more in the future. So last time I was in town, I had a meeting with a group of development professionals, and I just wanted to report back to steering committee. It was a really good and helpful meeting. We brought Gabby and I were able to do a PowerPoint presentation. So we talked about the project, where it is. A lot of faces I recognized from people who'd been involved in meetings with us and who have given feedback. The group as a whole is very interested in where we're going with updated processes, how we're going to clean up the application process. And like the discussion we were having earlier, where will there be potential opportunities to speed up, streamline development approvals? So we have let them know that we'll have a draft of module 1 ready to go after the first of the year, and that we would love the feedback. And I think the goal is to stay in touch so we can continue this conversation about benefits to the community, costs to the development community, and trade-offs that might help everyone get to the place to get to the housing development that the city wants to see, and the other amenities that the city wants to see. So that was probably about a couple hour meeting, fairly wide ranging, just about what's the project doing, where are we in the drafting, how can people be responsive, and different things people wanted to share with us.
And you said module 1, I think you meant module 3 is coming out after the first of the year.
Thank you. Yeah,
Okay,
module
just making
3.
sure.
Yeah, module 1 is drafted, comments are posted. The module 2 outreach materials, Gabby turned those into a survey and they are posted on the website. So if you want to share that with people, they are welcome to come in and respond to that survey if they weren't able to make it to a meeting. We had 4 or 5 meetings. We learned something new at every meeting, and sort of all of that is kind of feeding back into some of this conversation today. So we're thankful that you guys were able to help us stay on track. And then finally, I wanted to come back to the equity video. What do we think? Do you think its goal is just to be informational and to invite people into the project, to let them know this is something that we want to tackle? Do you feel like that is something we could post on the project site? And so people who are checking out the project site, learning about the project, that could be one aspect they'd learn about. Any thoughts, anything that you would recommend we add to it or do differently?
I thought it was really good, and I really like the content. I do think equity was a big part of it. I'm a little cynical at this point, and I feel like if you call it the equity video, it's probably going to turn off a certain segment of the population who has just decided to not identify with that, political persuasion at this point, right? That being said, it is a really useful primer on why things are the way they are and why they don't work for a lot of people. And it's stuff that has taken some of us years of background reading to understand. I still think it's very helpful.
Other thoughts on the video?
I was gonna say, I appreciate that comment. And I do get it. My just instinctive response is I don't want to back away from calling it an equity video, because the groups to whom we owe equity should know that we know what it is, I think. But I'm open to suggestions for other ways to make it inviting. Sorry, I stepped on someone.
So I completely understand what equity is and appreciate the video. I think my challenge to the group and myself as a builder is how, the financial side of that fits in, and do we really focus on tangible ways to make that work in the for-profit building community. I think everybody has, well, I'll say for me, I have a heart for affordable housing. I've always, felt that it was important in the community to give space for everybody that lived there. I think the interesting part, again, for-profit building, whether it's through incentives or different things, is like, how do we actually do that? And does our code allow flexibility, and I'm going to keep using the word for-profit building, to accomplish that, and do regulations over-regulating prohibit that? And I know that's a very challenging task to do. But I mean, I'm here because that's what I'm interested in. So I do appreciate the video. I am continuing to try to figure out how to accomplish that as a community with developers and builders and all the things that we all want or feel like we need. And ultimately the consumer pays for that. So how do we accomplish that?
I think that's what we're all trying to figure out.
That's all we're trying to figure out.
I think we're all trying to figure that
How
out.
do we present that? How do we do
And-
that?
Yeah,
Tangibly.
yeah.
Rebecca had her hand raised. But just
Rebecca?
anyway.
I just watched the most amazing video and our graphic stuff from Urban 3. Elizabeth, are you familiar with any of their work around the country? They model infrastructure costs and how suburban, giant, non-dense areas are really subsidized in essence over infill, more dense areas, and that inevitably more impoverished areas are actually paying more in property tax per square foot or acre. And I thought that was a really good way to get at that, let's not use an equity lens, but let's use an actual profit lens or economic development lens to say, why can we not annex these giant places, and why are we focused on infill and more dense ability to build? Because it is the only way you don't have a loss of infrastructure, income over time as a community. I mean, essentially, we are the more wealthy communities are getting a subsidy in their cost to the community. And I was thinking about that when we were talking about electricity and all the things, the water and pump stations in new developments. He was mapping, I think, Dallas, and there's a neighborhood that has 10 new pump stations. And when you cost that out, they're still paying the same taxes and mill levy and costs to develop, but their cost is 20 times more in infrastructure. And so I just thought that was a really interesting, I think some of that can be gotten that really makes people think in a different way about equity and the cost of development, and how do we spread that around fairly to developers as well.
And this is not to contradict Rebecca, because I think, she's spot on a lot of that. And I wrote that down. I'm going to research that, but I've read a lot of that. But maybe I misinterpreted because it went through kind of fast, but I'm always cautious about when we put that stuff out there and there's comments that reduces cost. I mean, sounds rather factual that this new zoning code is going to reduce our costs or make development less expensive. And I'm pretty sure what we've added to the code is making development more expensive. Incrementally, it's 10 dimes makes a dollar. And so all the little stuff just adds up over time. I haven't seen anything that we've done that reduces costs. So I think we need to be very careful about what we put in this video about saying we reduce costs or we reduce time or anything like that, unless we can completely support it with some kind of factual backup.
I want to push back on that just a little bit, Phil. Wait, hold on. I'm playing with color here. So I believe, if I understand correctly, one of the largest costs of development is the land cost. So by changing the code to allow development on much smaller lots, we are working towards reducing the cost of development.
The largest cost of development is the infrastructure.
On the on-site infrastructure?
Just the cost of infrastructure is.
I know, but the public side cost or the on-site cost?
I ask her but I mean, if you just say the cost of development, what's the most expensive piece of the land? No, I mean, the cost of streets, sewer, water, sidewalks, street trees.
Probably depends on the kind of development. If you're talking suburban tract home, probably infrastructure. If you're talking about infill, probably not infrastructure. It's probably land. And if we're talking about
if you're doing a tear down and buying a house and tearing it down, sure. I mean, but that house goes with the land. I mean, that wouldn't be a fair comparison.
Well, I mean, it's two very different kinds of development.
Our future development is greenfield development. I mean, we're running out of infill development land projects as fast as we can. I mean, we're about done with that chapter of our growth of the city.
I mean, in the current paradigm we are, but with the new code, the idea is to allow it to happen again, like it would have organically in the past, like allowing singles to become duplexes, allowing backyards to become ADUs.
Then that's going to be tear down.
Not necessarily. I have plenty of room on my 5,000 square foot lot with my stupid crappy house that I could easily fit 3 ADUs in the back. And I'm not the only one like that. So there's plenty of room out there. We just have drawn the lines and set the dimensions such that we can't do it.
So, but that's a good point. I mean, if we're going to make claims that, this new code is going to reduce costs, then let's back it up.
Well, I do also.
Because what are we saying? I mean, that was the point.
Well, I think a couple things is that also related to, back to this point you've made before, which is depends how you define it. Depends what metric you're using, and it depends what the private developer is willing to build. I mean, is a private developer willing to build a brand new green subdivision that instead of, 40 houses is, 20 houses 10 duplexes, 10 triplexes and 2 fullplexes and commercial.
Mhm.
And if we're measuring the cost of that per resident, that's a lot cheaper. You know, I mean,
Okay,
we've
yeah, fair
accomplished
enough.
something. It's a cheaper cost for development.
If our, a number of beds and.
If the number, that's what if that's what we're
Goes up,
doing.
then, yeah, if that's our measurement, then.
If your measurement is,
Mhm.
was the cost of building, 40 lots under the old code on a square piece of property and the cost of building 40 houses exactly the same in this code, have we reduced the cost there? You're saying you haven't seen anything on that, those two,
If that's.
that's the comparison.
Yeah.
I think what we're saying is
Yeah,
what you're comparing.
If our density, if we can justify and come up that our density has gone up enough to offset that, then, yeah,
The net.
you're right.
Yeah, that's the
But-
question. But
But,
there's other things you're talking about, like, I'm just throwing these out, I'm not saying you're suggesting these, don't require sidewalks or let the streets be 5 feet smaller or whatever it is. Those things,
Mhm.
even when you compare the two, you could see a cost reduction.
I mean, that's where that would come from. That's fair. That's totally fair.
Speaking of streets, actually, I thought that in the previous subdivision regulations, street widths were defined and then engineering design standards had them as well. I don't think they're in here anymore. Would, it's not really requiring, but allowing for smaller streets, like you're saying, when the cost of infrastructure controls in these kind of developments, would that help in terms of, letting you put in less expensive infrastructure by not having to pave over paradise, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I, so Rebecca would agree with this. I mean, if we could get streets narrower, we could put sidewalks on one side, if we could put our street trees every 80 feet instead of 40 feet. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff like that really would help.
Yeah.
The affordability of houses and.
A lot of stuff.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff.
Narrower streets reduces speeds. I mean,
Stormwater.
Yeah, stormwater, less runoff. Yeah.
Yeah. Sweet. Now we just have to convince MSO.
And fire department.
Yeah, but they can go
Yes.
down to 20 feet. I know their code. It's an PA and 20 feet is the minimum, so don't let them tell you otherwise.
Okay, Nick, I'm gonna have you in that meeting with me.
I'm ready.
Ready,
Mentally
okay.
prepared.
All right, let's wrap. Let's wrap, actually. So last thing I wanted to ask you guys, and I didn't put it on here, is, it's on the agenda. We are kind of coming around the bend into 2024. We would very much like for this to be the adoption year for the code. We'll get module 3 out and then all the pieces start coming together. We wanted to ask your preference as to a meeting schedule for this group for next year, at least, through June or July. And we wanted to suggest a monthly meeting schedule because we think that we'll get to a place where you'll want to have more discussions about how the pieces come together. But we want to be mindful of what that means to ask that of you and let the group discuss it and give us some feedback. If that is asking too much for your schedules, we'll figure out a way to perhaps make some information available separately from the meetings and then come back together to have the bigger discussions.
Well, as chair, I would jump in and say, one, I think we should do it every month, because I'd like to have this to the city commission by June. And two, as you can tell from the audience, if people can't make it, they don't make it. I mean, trying to spread out the meetings if you can't make it, you can't make it. If you can make it, you can make it. And I think we need to go to that, because I'd like this done by the summer.
I'm okay with monthly meeting. I mean, that was the commitment I made to get this process accomplished. So
I think that'd be good.
So we'll put together a schedule and share it with everybody after the first of the year so you can get it holds on your calendars. And we'll give you some look ahead at what we're going to share with you at the meetings and what the discussions will be. So that I think that would be great. I think I think we'd be greatly appreciative of it, and we will definitely not waste your time. Hopefully we'll leave you wanting to talk more. And there's Marcy.
Always do.
Marcy?
I would be happy to meet monthly, but the January, February, March are a little more difficult. I just wanted to mention that Fridays would be easier for me, probably not fun for anybody else, but I tossed that out there. So I
Fridays would not be
think
good for
we
me.
also could find out, is Thursday the best time for most people?
Well, that is a good question. Thursday, how's Thursday compared to other days of the week? Tuesdays are bad for me.
Wednesdays are bad for me.
Mondays are bad for me, so.
Yeah.
So I guess we're down to
We've
Thursday.
eliminated.
And Marcy, I know, I'm confident you'll still share your opinions, even if you're not here. I'm confident. Okay, anything else, Elizabeth?
Nope, that is it. Thank you all so very much. We'll get going with the instructions that you've given us, and we'll see you with at least part of module 3 in early January. We will still be doing staff review with it, but we are moving all the procedures into flowcharts so we can talk about where some of the sticky points might be and what the information looks like. And so we'll be ready to dive into that.
Perfect. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
We'll
you.
see you next time.
Yeah, I got to come with this.